Good evening, or good afternoon, or even good morning. My name is Paul Belz-Templeman. I'm stated clerk for the Presbytery of the Cascades, and I am recording this orientation to our Presbytery meeting that will be held in Vancouver, Washington. I'm recording this actually in Louisville, Kentucky, not far from the headquarters of the Presbyterian Church USA, where I'm getting ready for General Assembly, another sort of council meeting of the Presbyterian Church, excuse me, USA, which we are getting ready for happening in June. But this is about commissioner orientation for the Presbytery of the Cascades happening April 24th and 25th, 2026. So let's see if I can share full screen here so you can see what's going on. Okay. For this orientation, we have a docket. In the Presbyterian Church, for some reason, instead of saying agenda for our Presbytery meetings, even a lot of sessions will say, here is the docket for the meeting. It sounds more like a court than a board meeting or a convention or an annual meeting, but we use the word docket a lot. And so for this orientation, I've structured this as a docket or agenda, beginning with the structure of the Presbytery itself, then looking at the business coming to this Presbytery meeting. So I'm hoping that looking at the Presbytery structure, you'll understand what sort of business comes out of that structure and that you as a commissioner will be looking at. And then some tips to participate in the meeting. And then there could be questions answered or at least entertained. It looks like no one has joined me here. It's 10 p.m. Louisville time, 7 o'clock Pacific time. So if no one shows up, that's all right. We'll at least get through the first three items on my docket, or as other people would call it, other religions, other denominations might call this an agenda. So I have an agenda. We all have agendas. We all bring our own agenda to the meeting, but there's only one docket. So let's move forward with the Presbytery structure. Let's talk about the mission of the Presbytery. Presbytery of the Cascades has a mission statement that includes the words, cultivating spirit-led collaborative ministries that embody God's love in Jesus Christ. What we are attempting to do as a presbytery is embody God's love in Jesus Christ in a variety of collaborative ministries. Collaborative ministries is larger than congregations, but it certainly includes congregations. And we have 87 congregations. At this meeting, we're looking at a merger between two congregations, but congregations are a part of the collaborative ministries. Then we have new worshiping communities. We have other sorts of ministries that are affiliated with us. And all of those we are hoping can be spirit-led. And we're realizing in this day, as all of us seem to have diminishing resources, maybe not all of us, but there seems to be in some cases diminishing resources. And perhaps the word for this moment is, how do we collaborate together? How do we cooperate in what God wants to do through us as the church? Presbyterians, non-Presbyterians, all those who seek to follow the crucified and risen one, the one we know as Jesus Christ. I thought I would show you an organizational chart for the Presbytery. We put this together in 2024. One thing about presbyteries, which is what we are, this group of 86 churches and other ministries and ministers doing work in our region, is that our structure is continually changing. And so this is a structure we've kind of tried to capture what the structure looks like now, realizing there are some pieces that may be missing in order for us to fulfill this work, make it more efficient, and make it lean into our mission of being collaborative and cultivating ministries that embody the love of Jesus Christ. So the Presbytery of the Cascades up at the top, the Presbytery of the Cascades is not an office in Portland. It's not an office in any other city. It is a collection. In the Presbyterian Church, governance is done by, I almost said committees, but that's not correct. Governance is done by what we call presbyters or elders. When we say elders, we have ruling elders, those who govern the church, and ministers of the word and sacrament who govern the church, but particularly through preaching and administering communion, administering baptism, and building up the body that way. We need all of those folks. So many of you are ruling elders, and we need you in the Presbyterian system. We don't have a bishop, or if we do have a bishop, the bishop is what we call a corporate bishop, which is the presbytery. Instead of having one person make decisions, we all come together and make decisions. Now, because of the nature of, I guess, modern life and the pace of decision making and so on, we often, as a body, discern that we need to empower particular people to make decisions or carry out the mission of the church, but have some discretion to make decisions in the day to day. But ultimately, decisions are made by the presbytery. Underneath the presbytery, we have a structure to the right, which has some acronyms. Unfortunately, I used acronyms on this slide. We have one that doesn't have acronyms, but it is very cluttered because we have to pull everything out, uh, from beyond the acronyms and explain them. But so to the right, we have PJC, nominating, and core. So I'm going to just give you the acronyms because sometimes you'll hear the acronyms. PJC stands for the Permanent Judicial Commission. They are somewhat independent, or they are independent of other committees. Their work is around church judicial process. And there are two parts to church judicial process. There's the part where someone might say, hey, my session did something. I don't like the decision they made. I think it violated the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church USA. And I want to hold them accountable. And the session may not see it the same way. So there's a process by which you can have essentially something that kind of looks like a civil lawsuit, but it's in the church. It's called a complaint. And we work together, the Judicial Commission and others work together to try to find ways to resolve that and even go to something that looks like a trial. There's also a disciplinary part to the judicial process. And the disciplinary part is that because members are held accountable for things that violate the Constitution or scriptural ethical commands. And so we often, at the presbytery level, are looking at things that maybe pastors have done, or people say, pastor did something, we don't think this is right, it needs to be investigated. And we have a process that aims towards restoration in most cases. And there might be a rebuke. We might suggest supervised rehabilitation. There might be a time of temporary suspension of membership, ultimately coming back to a membership and full restoration, and hopefully healing any harms that were perpetrated by the offense. There is also a permanent exclusion from membership in severe cases. There's also a nominating committee. The nominating committee is the one that's responsible for bringing forth names so that the presbytery above them can elect folks to populate all these other colorful squares on this organizational chart. CORE stands for Committee on Representation, and they're charged with reminding the presbytery of the need to make sure that all voices are heard and that diversity is embraced. That's something the church has been doing at least since Pentecost in the first century. So those folks answer kind of directly to the presbytery and deal with specific things. To the left, you have the PLC, which is our Leadership Commission. In many ways, the PLC looks like a session. If you're a commissioner, you're probably a ruling elder and at some point served on session. The Leadership Commission isn't actually the session. The analog at the presbytery level to a session is actually the presbytery. So a session is often small, 5 members, maybe 20 members, something in that size. And a presbytery, well, our presbytery, at a meeting, you may have 180 to 200 people making a decision. It's just a larger council. That's what we call it in the Presbyterian Church. The General Assembly is a council. The Synod is a council. The Presbytery is a council. And then congregations aren't councils, but they have a council called a session. So the PLC, though, is the group that it's a commission, Presbytery Leadership Commission, and commissions are able to act on behalf of councils. And in this case, the Presbytery Leadership Commission, in order to do that, is supposed to have a nearly equal number of ruling elders, and teaching elders or ministers of the word and sacrament who discern things under the control of the presbytery that gives them specific things they can do between meetings. And part of what they do is they oversee different committees and commissions. So to the left, lower left of PLC, Presbytery Leadership Commission in green, there's that blue box, P&A, which stands for Personnel and Administration. So Personnel and Administration is a committee. And so they make recommendations in terms of hiring and promotions and the way we compensate our staff, the position descriptions for different staff members, the staffing model. And usually, or many times, the PLC, the Presbytery Leadership Commission, will actually take the action on behalf of the presbytery, often particularly if there's a sensitive issue, like there's an employee that maybe their employment needs to be terminated or something. We have a group in the Presbytery Leadership Commission, 11 folks, plus the Personnel and Administration Committee, which has 7 folks who can say, I think this is the direction we need to go without having to involve 200 people in a personnel issue. It seems a little large. So you have the Personnel and Administration Committee. Then you have below, to the right of that, it says missing macro. We're thinking there needs to be some other sort of committee at that level. And that's a vision that our transitional executive presbyter has been working on developing. We'll hear more about that in coming months, I'm sure. It's part of a larger plan. But we have these other groups, Commission on Preparation for Ministry, CPM, the Commissioned Ruling Elder Commission, which commissioned ruling elders. So preparation for ministry is preparation for minister, word of sacrament, pastoral ministry. Commissioned ruling elders is to commission ruling elders to function as pastors. And then we have the 4 regional commissions on ministry. And commissions on ministry, we'll talk a little more about what they do. But they all answer in some ways, perhaps, to the Presbytery Leadership Commission. They certainly answer to the Presbytery of the Cascades because they are commissions that are able to do things on behalf of the presbytery between meetings. And then we have the Board of Trustees, who is sort of the board of directors in corporate terms. It is also a commission in Presbyterian terms, which means as a commission, it can also do things on behalf of the presbytery. But in our structure, like many nonprofits, not all, and certainly like many churches, the trustees or the board has limited power, and it's only power that's delegated by the society, or in our case, what we call the council, the presbytery. And there are committees, subcommittees of the trustees that do property management, budget and finance, contracts and loans, and oversee our investments. Finally, we have 2 teams that we're trying to figure out where they would fit in this org chart. So they have a missing macro, meaning a macro committee or commission that would be above them, that would kind of be a buffer between them and the leadership commission. And one is the Communication and Technology team, CAT. The other is actually 2 teams now. It was one for a long time. It's recently split into 2 groups. One is the 1,001 New Worshiping Communities, which is that lower line. And above it, the NMT has become the MIC, which is the Missional Innovation and Collaboration Team. Talk a little bit more about those later. But you can see this is a structure. These groups are all populated by, in mostly equal numbers, we try the best we can, ministers and ruling elders. So we try to have balance between those. We try to have balance between men and women. And if you know, this presbytery is fairly large, so we try to have some regional balance. This presbytery has, aside from if you go down to under the PLC and the missing macro, the third from the left box is 4 regional COMs. Because the presbytery is so large, we don't have regional balance on each COM. We have each COM embodies a region, so it's more of a local ability to respond to pastoral and church needs. All right, enough about the organizational chart for now. Hopefully this kind of helps you in a way. It's not enough to do a lot with at this moment. Understand the structure of presbytery, what goes on between presbytery meetings, who's carrying out the work that presbytery says needs to be done, and who is bringing things to presbytery. So I do want to, and I alluded to this earlier, talk a bit about the difference between a presbytery and a congregation. So a congregation on the right side has a session. So session is the council of the congregation. The congregation itself, when it gathers, it has an annual meeting. Sometimes it has special meetings. That group doesn't have a lot of discretionary power aside from electing their session members who then exercise that authority on their behalf. The presbytery on the left, that is the council. There is nothing at the presbytery level that's not the council, as opposed to in the congregation, you have the congregation and then the smaller group called the council. But both groups have nominating committees. And at the congregational level, the nominating committee isn't under the session. The congregation elects the nominating committee directly. At least that's how the Book of Order envisions it. Some congregations have slightly different polities, and I won't get into that now. So the session may have commissions, and some do. Some sessions do have commissions where they say, you know what, instead of all of the session members getting together, we're going to allow two or three of them to meet to carry out particular tasks, perhaps bringing members into the church, perhaps working on the statistical report between session meetings and approving that. But at the presbytery level, we have a leadership commission, which has in its name commission. It's a commission, not a council, because again, it is under the direction of the council, which is the presbytery, and it has limited powers. Whereas session has quite a few powers enumerated in the Constitution, far more than the congregation has. Congregation essentially can elect leaders, elect ministers. What else can they do? They receive a lot of reports. They elect a nominating committee, I guess, to elect the leaders. Property sales, if the church is going to merge or something like that, that's all part of the congregation. But everything else is handled by the session. At the presbytery level, though, everything is handled by the presbytery, as I said. And again, due to the size of the council, we're moving down the boxes. Due to the size of the council and presbytery, lots of work done by commissions. Lots of work is done by commissions, including the leadership commission, including the commissions on ministry, who often a commission on ministry, instead of waiting for presbytery to gather once every quarter to do something, they'll say, oh, a pastor in a church, a church wants to call a pastor. We can approve that pastor so that business moves more quickly than if we had to wait 2 months, 3 months for a presbytery meeting. Right, but in most churches, decisions are made by session with some recommendations from committees. Presbytery also has committees that make recommendations. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. As I go down to the bottom, I probably should have said this earlier, but a commission is empowered to act on behalf of a council. It can actually make decisions. Committees can't make decisions. I mean, they do make decisions, but not important decisions. Committees make recommendations to councils or carry out decisions of the council. Now, sometimes when you carry out the decision, you still have to, as a committee, exercise some discretion, but usually it's curtailed. I have a little beef with the difference between commission and committee because I think there's a little more blur than we often think. But in general, commissions can do things that normally are reserved for the council to do, and committees make recommendations or carry out larger decisions. And a team, we often have things called teams. They're a committee by another name. So we have a few of those. They're organized slightly differently, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So we've been talking a lot about the difference between committees and commissions and councils. And so here at the presbytery, here's where a lot of the work gets done before or after presbytery meetings. There are some commissions, and there are 4 commissions. There are the board of trustees. There are the commissions on ministry. Actually, that's 4 or 3, depending on how you divide it up, commissions right there. Actually, I could say 5 or 6 commissions, but there's these commissions on ministry. There's the board of trustees above that. Commissions on ministry, commission on preparation for ministry, and the leadership commission. So the board of trustees is doing the leases, the sales, loans, some grants. It has authority to do those sorts of activities, approve loans between meetings. It doesn't have authority to approve sales and doesn't have authority to approve the initiation of a new loan, but it can approve grants and leases between meetings. The Commission on Ministry is approving pastors and searches, and when pastors leave a congregation, dissolving those relationships. And when a church is without a pastor, that's the way the presbytery is to provide pastoral leadership, temporary pastoral leadership to a congregation. Commission on Preparation for Ministry works with future ministers, people who are going to be ordained as word and sacrament or want to explore that process. And the Presbytery Leadership Commission, what said earlier, they do their session-like doing timely work. They also do visioning and planning on behalf of the presbytery. So in their commission reports, they will often report on actions taken on behalf of presbytery. Those are actions that are done as if the presbytery itself did them, because presbytery delegated that authority to do that to them. And so those actions in their reports become part of the presbytery minutes. Now, there are other groups that aren't commissions that still do work. So We're on the next slide of where the work gets done. Personnel administration, I think said before, is a committee that oversees the Presbytery personnel. Communication and technology team has done work on our communication structure in the Presbytery. Right now is doing a lot with grants for congregational technology, particularly around communication, audio and visual equipment, as we're doing a lot more live streaming now than we did a decade ago or even 7 years ago. Missional innovation and collaboration, that's a new group. And I think they're trying to figure out their exact lane. And their thought is that they're grants for congregational innovation facing outward. And then 1001 New Worshiping Communities is a denominational program. This is our team that interfaces with them. And that's grants for new communities facing outward. So they look kind of similar, but a church might say, we want to start as kind of a separate community in some ways. I mean, obviously, we're going to have some involvement and some people in it, but it's really going to kind of be its own thing. That would be a 1001 New Worshiping Community. The Missional Innovation Group says, well, what if you want to take your community and do more outreach? And do new initiatives towards that outreach, things you haven't done before. That becomes missional innovation, and there are grants for that. Finally, there is a nominating committee that finds candidates for Presbytery leadership. And if you haven't heard from them, maybe someday you will. And I hope you'll say yes, because one of the best ways to understand what an organization is doing is to join a committee. I was just at a congregation talking to someone who had to rotate off a committee after 6 years. And I said, are you glad you're not, part of that committee? Boy, that was a lot of work on the trustees. And she said, oh, yeah, it was a lot of work. And I'm grateful for the break, but I miss the people I got to work with just from different churches and the experience they brought and the projects we were able to work on. And that was exciting to hear. It takes a while to understand an organization. So when you join a committee, as Hugh Cannon, a famous parliamentarian, said back in the 1980s, that's the best way to understand an organization. Join the committee, learn that way. Just jump right in. Anyway, committee reports, they report work carried out that the presbyteries ordered them to do or instructed them to do, and they recommend actions by presbytery. So keep that in your mind. And just now, because I didn't know where to put this, Presbytery grants, we were talking about the missional innovation grants and the new worshiping grants. So the grants in red, there are these 3 grants that we've been giving out. And actually, one of them is new, the missional innovation grant. So we're trying to kind of tease out how these might look. And I don't think we've hit final form yet, but the Vitality Group was grants, which is administered by the trustees right now. It's work to vitalize existing congregational work. Like, hey, we'd like to improve this program. We have this work in our congregation. We'd like to strengthen the youth program. Missional innovation grant would be, we want to do, as I said earlier, sort of new congregational ministry to the community, where we're saying we want to create a new ministry, not the youth program, but something, maybe it is a youth program, but it's a different way of doing it, completely different, that is our congregation ministering to the community. 1001 New Worshiping Communities, our congregation wants to sort of give birth to something that is a separate identity in many ways. It's creating a new independent entity that, again, is trying to bring God's good news and embody God's love in our region. And there's probably some crossover here. These aren't really hard and fast, bright lines between them. But that's what we're working on, is how would these grants go out? And these are available. You look on our Cascades Presbytery website. If you have any thoughts about these things or ideas, these committees are there to consult with. And you can always contact me as the stated clerk. I'm sort of the one that connects folks. And we can figure out kind of the best place to start if you have some ideas, thoughts on outreach. We also, let's go down to the green grants really briefly. We've got Barnabas grants, which are to update facilities for, say, Americans with Disability Act improvements, large-scale maintenance, capital improvements up to $8,000. Those grants are very helpful for congregations. They're not a lot of money, but sometimes just enough to help when the boiler goes out or there's a big plumbing problem, whether it's an emergency or just we need to, we have aging equipment on our property that we need to update before it causes more problems, the roof or whatever. Peacemaking grants are to inspire active peacemaking in congregations and beyond. That program is administered in partnership with the denomination. Soon it will just be, there'll be a grant process through the denomination. Actually, that is starting this year. However, Presbytery still has peacemaking grant money on hand, probably around $20,000. So if you have any ideas about things that you think might be peacemaking, and it's a very broad category, again, let me know. I can help you navigate that process. And there are cross-cultural partnerships. We have about $7,000 left. It was a much larger project before. And these are projects where a congregation or a group within the presbytery says, we want to partner across cultural lines with another church or another group. There's been groups that have done educational events, groups that have done projects to bless the community using these grants. And it was the essential criteria there is there some way in which you're moving beyond your own, kind of cultural familiarity and moving cross-culturally? I guess that's self-explanatory. If it's not, you can always ask me more questions. But let's go back to the Presbyterian meeting, okay? So how does business get to the meeting? Well, there are background papers for the meeting, and hopefully you've seen those, and there's all these reports in there. Sometimes a commission has to act like a committee and recommend rather than act. So they bring items for business. We'll see this a little later, but the Board of Trustees does not have the ability on their own to approve the sale of church property. Congregations must get permission, according to the Book of Order, from the Presbytery in order to sell real property. The trustees make recommendations. So they study it and make recommendations to the Presbytery about various properties that someone wants to sell. And there's a church that wants to sell a house that they were using for rental income and now want to sell it. So that's coming to the meeting. Then again, as I said, committees bring reports, often for action. Personnel and administration, as I said, often take things directly to the Leadership Commission. But in this case, they're going to be talking about changing the job titles of two of the positions and also increasing the time and compensation for one of the Presbytery's employees. And if you've seen all that work, you know I might be speaking somewhat obliquely because some of that relates to me. All right. And then there's also new business, a possibility. A congregation or even a commissioner could say, I have this idea for new business. And because we're a meeting that doesn't meet very often and we're a large group, we generally would refer that business, but we have the opportunity, if we want, to take up that business as a presbytery and make a decision at this meeting, or at least to refer it to a committee and then hopefully see it steer its way through, maybe with some committee recommendations to perfect it or improve it until it comes back to presbytery later. So, a little bit more about this before we get back into the business, but there are Presbytery meeting voters. Who gets to vote at the Presbytery meeting? Who are the voting members? In many ways, the members of a organization are those who have the ability to vote. There are other kinds of members, but the true members, I don't know if that's the right word, that seems like there's false members, but the full members are those that have the right to vote. So commissioners, now a commissioner is someone who generally comes from a congregation, is an elder who's been elected, doesn't need to be on the session of the church, but is an elder who is elected by the session to, I want to be careful not use the word represent, but come to the meeting in order to discern the will of Christ with other commissioners and members. So I say commissioners are like delegates. So often in conventions, each subunit gets to bring so many delegates to a meeting. And so it's very similar to delegates. But the reason we don't use delegates is not so much because like agenda and docket, that whole nonsense I was going on about earlier, not nonsense, but it's just terminology that I'm not really sure what the distinction is. Here, there is a good distinction. Delegates, according to, say, Robert's Rules of Order, can be instructed by the subunit to vote a particular way at the convention, at the meeting of the larger unit. But commissioners are specifically told that they must vote their conscience and they must be open to the work of the Holy Spirit. And we actually believe that when people gather together prayerfully to make decisions, sometimes you come into the meeting with a very strong idea one way, and because of the work of the Holy Spirit, you may actually decide at some point through the deliberation of the body to vote in a different way. And it can go, it could be you, it could be somebody else, who knows? That minds are changed. And that's a beautiful thing in my view about Presbytery. The commissioners are to come, and yes, of course, they're going to come with their ideas and their strong convictions. And at some point, it's hard to set those aside. And not, people don't 180% change every single conviction they bring into the meeting with them. But on some issues, some people will change their minds. Now, there are also members. So ministers of the presbytery are members of the presbytery. They're not actually members of congregations. And as members, they are voting members of the presbytery. So we say each church has two commissioners, and then larger churches, just based to have a little better representation. If you have another 200 members or so, you get a third commissioner. You have 400 members, you get four commissioners, and so on. If you have racial ethnic folks in your church, who are ruling elders, we allow those folks to also serve as delegates because we're trying to increase our representation and diversity. So those are based on sort of a number, but ministers is also a number, I guess. But every single minister theoretically could come to the meeting, and we have over 300 ministers. Many of them are retired. You keep your membership in Presbytery until you die. So there are many who are unable to attend meetings. So we get 100 ministers, 100 commissioners from our churches that show up. And because of this, you have, members generally don't go to conventions, they go to meetings. So some folks have said that the Presbyterian meetings are like a quasi convention. It's like a membership meeting for an organization, but it's also like a convention where delegates gather. But in some ways, that's just because that's one way of dividing up meetings. That's not the way you necessarily need to do that. So we call it the Presbyterian meeting. There are delegates and members. And if you see below, there's the double asterisks that say there are also commissioners in virtue of service to presbytery. So there are some ruling elders who are not elected directly from their congregation. Instead, they've been elected to certain offices in the presbytery, and we say, oh, because you're serving the presbytery on a committee or on a commission, or you're one of the officers, you're the moderator or the treasurer, and you're a ruling elder, you also are entitled to vote at the presbytery meeting. Part of that is because for whatever reason, we're trying to have parity between ministers and ruling elders. And we often have more ministers than ruling elders in the room. So we've tried to create other ways that we can increase the number of commissioners. So that's who's going to be at the meeting. Voting, speaking. The voters also are allowed to speak in debate and making motions. They'll have the right to make motions, though we limit when you can make motions to a very brief new business period, mainly because that's kind of what you do in more of a convention setting where you say, we have a lot of business that could come up and we haven't budgeted for an extra 6 hours at this meeting. So we need notice of motions in general. All right. So hopefully you got background papers, and there's a consent agenda, which shows action items. Those are motions that need to be adopted. And then there are other motions in the paper that often at the top, we try to put them at the beginning of reports. In many organizations, like in Robert's Rules of Order, they suggest that the committee reports everything, and at the bottom of the report, it has the motions it's making. We put the motions at the top because some of our reports don't have motions. It just feels like that's a way. We've been doing it for a long time. It's just a way that you can look at the report and say, is there anything for action? It's at the top. Good, I know what it is. All right, so that's what to look for. There's a lot in the background papers. Often there's 70, 80, 90 pages. And I don't say you shouldn't read it, but if you don't have time, what you really want to look at is what are the items that are coming to this meeting that we need to know what they are so we can vote on them. That's the action items. That's the action items on the consent agenda. By the way, consent agenda uses unanimous consent. So because things require a majority, and some things actually require a 2/3 vote to pass, one way you can move through business more quickly is rather than take a vote, you can say, if there's no objection, we will adopt the motion. And all it takes is one person to object. But if no one objects, It's often called general consent or unanimous consent because people say, well, it's not really unanimous. No one objected. Doesn't mean everyone was in favor of it. I might decide, I don't want to waste a lot of time on this. I could object, there'd be a vote, and I'm clear that I would be on the losing side when I vote no. So I'm not going to object. I know 90% of the folks here, or close to 100%, want this motion to pass. I have my reasons, my reservations. They're not important enough for me at this time to do something. So I'm not going to object. So I don't say anything. I didn't vote yes, but I didn't object. And that's one way to do business without taking a vote. So that's what the unanimous or the consent calendar or consent agenda is. And so you can call out the number of an item if you want it removed from the consent agenda. So I'm going to stop this share and open another document to show you the consent agenda, hopefully. So you can see at the top of the consent agenda, you can see that those words for action in blue. And one of them, for some reason on here, is adopt the docket, because at one meeting we did have the docket as something to adopt. I don't think we're going to keep that on the consent agenda. I'm going to pull it immediately before we even get to the consent agenda. But then there's a necrology report that's received from the stated clerk's report. So you'd have to go to the stated clerk's report and find the information, the names in the necrology report. And someone might want to pull that because I spelled a name wrong or I have the wrong name in there. And you just say, remove item 2, or accept the resignation of service, or accept moderator appointment. So sometimes we don't hold elections at every meeting, but the moderator can appoint people, and then they serve until the next, I guess, annual meeting, which happens in June, July of the Presbytery. That's the meeting where we would hold elections. And so they're elected to fill a vacancy until that meeting, and then they could be reelected or someone else can be elected or whatever. And there's reports of administrative commissions. So there's 4 items on there says 5. There are 5 items on the consent agenda. I'm going to pull one before we even get there at the meeting, but then people are free to pull any of these. If they're not pulled, if no one says take off number 3, take off number 4, then we say, well, if no one objected to anything, there being no objection, the items on the consent agenda are adopted in gross or all together. All right. So that's a little look at the consent agenda. We'll have those up on slides at the meeting. Speaking of slides, I'll go back to my slides. Oops, that's the one I want. So that was the unanimous consent in the consent calendar. We can use unanimous consent at other times. For instance, when you close debate, people don't know this, but it requires 2/3 of folks to close debate. One way to do that is there's a motion called calling the question or moving the previous question, which is a way of closing debate, and that requires a 2/3 vote. What people don't know is that generally the way debate is closed is by unanimous consent. And one way you can object to the closing of debate is to stand up and go to the microphone or raise your hand and say, I want to debate. Seeing no one rising to debate, or there being no one rising to debate, debate is closed. I just closed debate by unanimous consent. Okay, took a 2/3, but because no one objected, more than 2/3 were fine with it. In fact, it seems like everyone was fine with closing debate. Okay, why isn't this working? I'm back here. Let's see if I can go back to my share. Close down on me. Okay. So again, consent agenda, you can remove any and all items. We also have at this meeting an overture to the General Assembly, and it comes from one of our commissioners and from the General Assembly commissioners who've agreed that this is something to go to the General Assembly. Presbyteries can overture the General Assembly. That means they can send business to the General Assembly, and this business, we hope, will go there. And it's based on the April 3rd Jeju tragedy, which was 7 years of violence from 1947 to 1954 on an island off of South Korea, missing an L there, violence that resulted in 14,000 to 30,000 deaths under South Korean and United States forces. So many of our Korean churches, probably not all, would like to do something that acknowledges this event, ask for some repentance, and a way of trying to console and bring healing to that part of the world that's important to many of us. We also have a personnel administration committee report that's going to bring some business. They're going to change titles for the stated clerk and the advocate for congregations and clergy. Right now, I'm the stated clerk. They would like to make me the associate executive presbyter and stated clerk, and the advocate for congregations and clergy. They want to make the associate executive for and advocate for congregations and clergy, primarily just to clarify what our roles are among our other presbyteries so they understand what an advocate for congregations and clergy is. And they say that as the stated clerk, I think that's probably true. I do a lot of work that's done by executives and other presbyteries. I do clerk work plus. So they wanted to do that. And by the way, right now I'm 80% time, so I might not finish 100% of this, but I'm actually they want to make me 100% time retroactive to April 1st. So I better complete this training. Hang in there with me. We're over 80% done. All right. Also at this meeting, the Commission on Ministry has a church merger, merging the Calvary Presbyterian Church in Portland and Mount Tabor Presbyterian Church in Portland. And just really quickly, oftentimes for shorthand, and this has been going on for years in the Presbyterian Church, we have the name of the city, comma, name of the church. So Portland, comma, First, Portland, comma, Calvary, Portland, comma, Westminster. If you're Aurora, it's just going to say Aurora. If you were, let's see, where else? Trying to think. Corvallis, First, that sort of thing. So anyway, just so you know, there's Calvary Presbyterian Church and Mount Tabor are hoping to merge, and the Presbytery will need to approve that. So there's a little bit of information there. I think you'll hear more at the meeting about the merger on Saturday. There are also many reports at the meeting, and sometimes people think, oh, reports, there's no action there. Well, that's true. We're going to hear 1001 New Worshiping Communities. They brought in Sean Kang, and Sean is from the denomination level. He's a regional I guess like director for 1001 New Worshiping Communities, and he'll be sharing some exciting stories of some projects around the nation, particularly in the West, as well as talking about the New Worshiping Communities is working on how they can be more effective and get more collaboration between congregations and get some excitement around these things. We're also, as our Presbytery Leadership Commission, will be talking about trust building and mission. A few years ago, we identified that there are some issues with trust in our presbytery, that there were committees that didn't quite trust each other. Some of that was structural, some of that was, who knows, just other things, just being human. And so we're working to cultivate trust. I guess part of it is, here we are on Zoom, and you don't see, my body language. You don't know if you can trust me because I'm just a face on a screen. So we're trying to figure out ways to cultivate more trust in the presbytery. Never a bad thing. We want to share those learnings with our congregations because trust is a good thing, and the more of it we have, the better. As well as we're working on a mission study. Right now, we're in a time of transition with a transitional executive, and we're working towards a new structure and new ways of, what are our values? What are we trying to do in 2028 and 2030 and 2035? And how do we prepare for that so that we can embody God's love in our communities? We're going to hear from our Warm Springs Commission. You'll hear some great news about the manse at Warm Springs that I think is 100% done. I mean, it's like many building projects where you're almost done and there's just like one more permit or one more inspector that needs to come, or there's one thing on the tick list that hasn't been done satisfactorily, even though they've come out to do it twice, right? So they're just like very excited that we've got this. We have a congregation at Warm Springs on the reservation, and they're excited. We're excited. Some great collaboration there. You'll hear from the treasurer, things going on with the finances in this presbytery. No spoilers there, but you can always read the report and see some of the things going on there. Okay, finally, so I've given you some reports, things to look forward to at the meeting. Hopefully I've made it sound exciting. I think one of the great things about the meeting is just there's opportunities to worship, to meet other Presbyterians from other churches, to learn. One of the things I think we often learn is we think, boy, our church has a real problem here, this or that. It's common to a lot of us. People often call me and say, oh, I can't believe this is happening. I'm almost embarrassed to call you. And I was like, well, you sound like a Presbyterian church to me. I've been there. I've been on both sides of that issue. I've been I've offended people. I've been offended. I'm human. So you get to learn what churches are doing, how churches are persevering in these challenging times to be in ministry as a congregation. So here's some useful motions at a presbytery meeting. So one is a request for information. You can always just ask a question. Well, not always, but if we're going to vote on something and we've closed debate, you can't. But generally, you can ask a question. Instead of feeling like you need to debate something, you hear people going pro and con, you can just say, I have a request for information. I'm just like, can someone explain to me, what exactly you mean by this motion? And that's a reasonable question. You don't even need a second to have a request for information. It's beautiful. Parliamentary inquiry is similar to a request. In fact, you could use either of them interchangeably. If you rise for either of them and you use the wrong form, we'll figure out what you want to do. So a parliamentary inquiry is like, I'm trying to understand, like, what are we voting on? Or I I'd like to change that motion. And you said it's undebatable, but can I change it or amend it? So sometimes things are undebatable, but you can amend them. So not a bad thing to ask. There are motions of personal privilege, and people often think personal privilege means I get to speak about whatever I want. But really, what personal privilege is to address something affecting the ability to participate. Point of personal privilege, the microphone has a lot of feedback, or the doors are open in the back and it's really loud out there, or people are talking, I can't hear. And then oh, thank you, or whatever. That's a point of personal privilege. Or it's getting really hot in here. Can somebody open some windows or turn the heat down? That sort of thing. There's also a point of order. I think there's a violation of a rule. We don't hear many of those anymore, but every so often we do. Probably should hear, maybe we should hear more. I mean, there's not a chiding thing. It's just like, hey, I think you violated a rule here. Point of order. I thought we had an amendment. Why are we voting on the main motion? Oh, I made a mistake. Okay, you're right. Let's vote on the amendment first. That sort of thing. Um, Amend is the motion we use to change something in a motion. Refer is to refer to a committee if you think it needs more study. And if you don't know where to refer something, like let's say the debate is going on for a long time in the Presbytery meeting and think, I don't know if we're making any progress here. But you think, well, I wouldn't know what committee to refer that to. Like, I don't know where that goes. The default in this presbytery is to refer it to the Presbytery Leadership Commission because they could always sort it out, or someone else could say, well, that's great. Thank you for saying referral. If you want to refer this to a committee, we can amend it and say, we'll send it to Commission on Ministry or Personnel or whatever if we think that's better. There's also the motion to postpone, which is either to later in the meeting or to a special meeting. And one thing about postpone that has been challenging in the past, we had 3 meetings a year, and you can't postpone something to a meeting that occurs more than a quarter after your meeting takes place, according to Robert's Rules of Order. That's generally not the problem, but you can't postpone something till next year. You got to postpone it till the next meeting that happens within the next, technically, like up to 120 days, depending on where you are in the month. There's the previous question, which you might have heard people call the question. Some people think if you call the question, that means debate ends. No, it's a motion that says, I think it's time to call it end debate. Someone else says second. Okay, then we'll vote on it. You can't debate it because we're trying to end debate. That would defeat the purpose. And if you get 2/3 of the people to say, yes, we're done debating, then we move on to vote on that motion we were just debating. Well, there's a lot of other motions, a whole book of them. These are some useful motions. Generally, when folks are in the room, we're able to have a little conversation about how those things work. But maybe those will stimulate your mind for participating in the meeting. I think a lot of people are hoping to debate or make a motion. And sometimes I think the easiest way in is just to ask a question. So you can request information or do a parliamentary inquiry. Okay, wow. Business at this meeting. Wow. And I'm going over. I'm sorry. Well, I'm not going over yet. We haven't hit the hour yet, but I try to keep it to 45 minutes. Trustees. They're going to permit Moreland Presbyterian Church in Portland to sell a house. That's what they'd like. That's their motion. They recommend that. Did I already do that? Are we had questions? Oh, yes. All right. So this is when we'd have questions. If you have questions after watching this video, you can always email me and I'll try to get back to you before the meeting. Or if you see me at the meeting, you can always ask me a question. Come up and find me. I'm usually near the front of the room or I'm running around. Doing something that I forgot to do earlier or happened. Anyway, hopefully this will be helpful. Hopefully we'll see you at the meeting. Look forward to it. I pray it will be a great meeting for all of us. We'll be enriched. We will discern together and we will make a difference, maybe a small difference, but incrementally. We will continue in our growth as a presbytery to embody the love of Jesus Christ to our neighbors in the region we serve. All right. Good night. Good morning. See you at the meeting.